In the early hours of January 10th, something fundamentally shifted deep inside Russian territory. Far from the front lines, a cornerstone of Moscow's long-range strike capability was quietly removed from the equation. One of Russia's most valuable strategic bombers and aircraft designed to project power across continents was rendered unusable without ever taking off. No dramatic aerial duel followed, no prolonged engagement. Yet by dawn, the consequences were already cascading through Russia's military planning. This was not simply the loss of a single aircraft, it was the sudden absence of an entire layer of capability. Alongside the disabled bomber, a major cruise missile stockpile was destroyed, erasing months of preparation in a matter of minutes. Winter strike plans that had been carefully scheduled, fueled, and loaded were abruptly canceled before launch. The damage was not measured in headlines, but in empty hangars, missing munitions, and forced recalculations. By morning, Russian planners were no longer focused on messaging or optics. Their attention turned inward toward logistics and timelines. Missiles that had taken years to produce were gone. A bomber valued in the hundreds of millions was grounded indefinitely. Maintenance schedules were rewritten overnight, and strategic aviation units faced months of disruption. The loss extended far beyond hardware. It fractured the rhythm of planned operations. What made the event especially significant was its location. This was not a contested zone or an exposed forward base. It was deep inside territory, long considered secure, protected by distance-layered air defenses and reputation. The assumption that strategic assets were untouchable had quietly shaped years of planning. That assumption did not fail gradually. It collapsed instantly. The strike forced an uncomfortable realization: modern warfare no longer respects traditional boundaries of safety. Assets designed to survive nuclear-era threats proved vulnerable to a different kind of pressure, precision, persistence, and asymmetry. The cost of replacement was measured not just in money, but in time capacity and lost momentum. By the end of that day, the real impact became clear. Russia had not merely lost equipment, it had lost options. And in modern conflict, the sudden loss of options can be more damaging than destruction itself. As daylight spread across the base, the scale of what had happened began to settle in. There were no burning runways or shattered control towers, yet the damage was unmistakable. Russia's Strategic Aviation Command found itself facing a reality that could not be concealed or quickly repaired. What was lost was not just physical equipment, but operational continuity, the invisible backbone that allows long-range strike forces to function. Instead of tracking news cycles, planners were forced into rapid internal accounting. Missile inventories were suddenly thinner. Aircraft that should have been available for rotation were grounded. Maintenance timelines stretched from weeks into months. Even assets that remained intact were affected as support systems, crews, and logistics chains were thrown out of balance. One disruption propagated outward, touching units that had not been directly attacked. Strategic bombers are not interchangeable tools. Each airframe represents years of investment, specialized training, and tightly coordinated infrastructure. Removing even one from service introduces friction across the entire system. Flight schedules must be reworked. Crews are reassigned or left idle. Spare parts are diverted from other aircraft, compounding stress elsewhere in the fleet. The cost of downtime begins to rival the cost of destruction. More critically, the loss reshaped planning assumptions. Winter strike campaigns depend on timing. Weather windows target readiness and synchronized launches. With missiles destroyed and a bomber incapacitated, dozens of planned operations were no longer viable. Some were postponed indefinitely, others were abandoned outright. The absence of visible explosions masked a deeper disruption: the sudden collapse of carefully sequenced plans. What emerged was a quiet form of damage that modern militaries fear most. There was no single target to retaliate against, no clear moment to declare recovery. Instead, there was a growing list of constraints. Every option now required re-evaluation. Every future sortie carried higher cost, longer preparation, and greater risk. By the end of the day, the lesson was unmistakable. Strategic power is not only about what a military owns, but about what it can reliably deploy on schedule. When that reliability is broken, even without dramatic destruction, the impact reverberates far beyond the point of attack. Russia was left not just counting losses, but confronting the fragility of a system once assumed to be resilient by design. What made this moment especially consequential was not the damage itself, but the belief it shattered. For years, certain Russian military assets were treated as functionally untouchable. Distance cost and layered defenses combined to create a sense of permanence around strategic aviation. These platforms were not just weapons. They were symbols of deterrence meant to exist beyond the reach of disruption. That belief quietly guided planning posture and risk tolerance. On this night that logic failed, the bomber at the center of the incident was not lost in combat or overwhelmed by force. It was undone by exposure left visible stationary and assumed safe. Delays in maintenance and fractured logistics turned a temporary vulnerability into a critical one. What should have been a protected asset became a single point of failure. The issue was not negligence in isolation, but overconfidence embedded in routine. Russian planners had relied heavily on the idea that a wide defensive umbrella guaranteed security. Air defense coverage extended hundreds of kilometers on paper, designed to defeat fast, high-altitude threats approaching from predictable directions. The system was optimized for a certain kind of danger and blind to others. Safety was defined by doctrine, not by reality on the ground. This is where the deeper shift occurred. The attack was not about overpowering defenses. It was about refusing to play by their assumptions. Instead of matching speed with speed or altitude with altitude, the operation exploited what had been deprioritized: proximity, persistence, and patience. The result was not chaos, but quiet access. By the time the vulnerability was recognized, it was no longer theoretical. A strategic asset once protected by reputation alone had been proven reachable. That realization rippled outward, forcing a reassessment of what secure actually meant. If this could happen here under these conditions, then similar assumptions elsewhere were now suspect. The most damaging outcome was not the grounded aircraft or the destroyed munitions. It was the loss of certainty. Strategic planning depends on confidence in baselines, what can be relied upon, what can be assumed safe. That night erased one of those baselines. From that point forward, distance was no longer a guarantee, cost was no longer protection, and reputation was no longer a shield. In modern warfare, the most dangerous moment is not when defenses fail, but when they succeed at protecting the wrong expectations. In the hours leading up to the strike, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The airbase continued to function under what commanders considered routine conditions. Radar coverage was active, personnel rotations were normal, and defensive systems remained aligned with established doctrine. From the perspective of those in charge, the situation did not warrant heightened alert. The base had been secure before, and there was no clear reason to believe that had changed. That confidence rested on a specific vision of threat. Russian air defenses around strategic bases were engineered to counter speed, altitude, and mass. They were designed to stop aircraft and missiles moving fast, flying high, and emitting unmistakable signatures. The farther away a threat originated, the more time the system had to react. Distance itself was treated as a protective layer, reinforcing the belief that valuable assets could not be approached directly. Yet this logic came with an unspoken assumption that any serious attack would announce itself. Loud, fast, and unmistakable. As a result, defensive priorities narrowed. Objects moving slowly, flying low, or blending into background clutter were treated as secondary concerns. Resources were allocated upward, outward, and forward toward threats that fit expectations. This created a subtle vulnerability, one that did not appear on readiness charts or coverage maps. Defensive systems were strong but rigid. They excelled at responding to known patterns while struggling to adapt to unfamiliar ones. Procedures reinforced those patterns over time, turning assumptions into habits. What began as efficiency hardened into predictability. The exposed bomber on the apron became a symbol of that mindset. Its presence in the open was not viewed as dangerous but temporary. Protection was assumed to exist in layers beyond what the eye could see: radar range, missile reach, and reputation itself. The absence of immediate warning signals reinforced the sense that nothing had changed. But modern conflict does not always challenge strength directly. Sometimes it challenges expectation. The greatest weakness that night was not a missing weapon or malfunctioning system. It was the belief that security could be defined by altitude and distance alone. By the time that belief was tested, the outcome was already set in motion. The base was not undefended, it was misaligned with the threat it was about to face. And in warfare shaped by adaptation rather than force, misalignment can be more dangerous than absence. The flaw did not appear suddenly. It emerged quietly at the intersection of confidence and routine. Defensive doctrine had been refined over years to deal with specific threats, fast, high-altitude weapons designed to strike from long range. Everything about the system was calibrated for that reality. Detection thresholds, engagement priorities, and operator training all reinforced the same expectation. Danger would arrive loudly and from above. What was quietly deprioritized was persistence at close range. Objects flying low were not ignored entirely, but they were categorized differently. Below certain altitudes, targets blended into clutter terrain reflections, weather effects, civilian noise. Filtering these signals was necessary to prevent constant false alarms. Over time, that filtering became institutionalized. Low-altitude movement was not seen as impossible, just improbable. And improbability in complex systems often becomes invisibility. This is where the narrow gap formed. Not a hole in coverage, but a space between assumptions. The defenses were strong, but they were optimized in one direction. Speed mattered more than patience. Altitude mattered more than proximity. The system was built to defeat threats that matched its expectations, not those that refused to do so. Confidence hardened into procedure. Anything below a certain height was treated as a secondary concern, something to be handled later if necessary. Attention flowed upward by default. Operators trusted that anything truly dangerous would announce itself early enough to be addressed decisively. That trust shaped response time, target classification, and engagement order. What made this vulnerability so dangerous was its subtlety. Nothing was broken. No radar was offline. No battery was missing. The system worked exactly as designed. But design reflects priorities, and priorities reflect beliefs. When those beliefs are wrong, efficiency becomes exposure. The night did not challenge the system with overwhelming force. It challenged it with contradiction. A threat that moved slowly, stayed low, and refused to fit predefined categories, slipped into a space where reaction time was no longer generous. By the time attention shifted downward, the advantage had already changed hands. This was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of imagination. The defenses were prepared for the most likely attack, not the most adaptive one. And in modern warfare, the gap between likelihood and possibility is often where decisive moments occur. When an enemy refuses to follow the pattern you trained for, even the strongest shield can be bypassed, not by breaking it, but by moving where it is not looking. The moment the operation truly began did not involve explosions, alarms, or radio chatter. It began with silence. Long before any strike assets moved, the battle space was entered by machines designed not to fight but to observe. Their purpose was simple and precise: confirm vulnerability, measure routine, and verify assumptions. Nothing more, nothing less. These initial platforms did not announce themselves. They traveled low enough to merge with terrain, following natural features that disrupted line-of-sight detection. Rivers, tree lines, and pockets of mist became cover. Their propulsion systems were chosen for discretion rather than speed, generating minimal acoustic and thermal signatures. Against systems tuned to look outward and upward, they appeared as background noise if they appeared at all. What mattered was not finding the target. Its location was already known. What mattered was confirmation. Was the asset still exposed? Were protective measures temporary or permanent? Were patrols predictable? These questions could not be answered by satellites or assumptions. They required presence. For hours, these reconnaissance drones operated inside defended airspace without triggering escalation. They did not transmit constantly or call attention to themselves. Data was collected passively, time-stamped, and stored for later analysis. Patterns emerged quickly. Guard movements followed consistent cycles. The exposed asset remained stationary. No emergency procedures were initiated. Routine held. This phase of the operation was the most dangerous and the most decisive. A strike can fail and still be repeated. Reconnaissance, once detected, closes doors permanently. That is why patience mattered more than aggression. The drones did not rush. They waited, watched, and confirmed. By the time they withdrew, nothing on the ground had changed. From the defender's perspective, the night had passed uneventfully. From the attacker's perspective, the battlefield was already mapped. Every assumption had been tested and found wanting. The significance of this phase is often underestimated. It demonstrates a fundamental shift in modern conflict. Victory is increasingly determined before the first weapon is launched. When observation goes uncontested, action becomes inevitable. The strike that followed was not a gamble. It was the execution of a decision made hours earlier when silence went unanswered and exposure remained uncorrected. By the time defenses realized they were under attack, the most important part of the fight, the question of whether the target was reachable, had already been settled. Once observation was complete, the operation shifted from patience to motion with remarkable speed. There was no dramatic countdown, no visible buildup that could be detected from afar. The transition was subtle, almost seamless, designed to preserve the advantage earned during the reconnaissance phase. What followed was not a single launch, but a carefully staged emergence. Along natural corridors that cut through the landscape, small attack platforms began lifting into the air. They did not rely on traditional launch infrastructure or emit the signatures normally associated with strike assets. Instead, they rose quietly, staying close to the surface, using terrain as both cover and guide. Within moments, isolated movements became a coordinated flow. This was not a force built around speed or shock. It was built around denial, denial of detection, denial of reaction, time, denial of clarity. Each drone followed preloaded navigation paths referencing terrain and visual markers rather than emitting constant signals. Once airborne, there was no need for ongoing communication. Silence was not a limitation, it was protection. The formation did not remain static. As more platforms joined, spacing adjusted dynamically to reduce the risk of chain losses. Altitudes were kept deliberately low, skimming just above features that radar systems struggled to resolve cleanly. The objective was not to rush toward the target, but to arrive unseen. Progress was measured, controlled, and calculated. From the defender's perspective, nothing appeared out of sequence. No sudden radar spikes, no urgent alerts. The airspace looked normal because the attack did not behave like an attack was supposed to. It did not climb. It did not accelerate dramatically. It did not announce intent. This phase revealed a crucial evolution in modern strike design. Instead of attempting to penetrate defenses through force, the operation sought to exist beneath them. It treated defensive systems not as walls to be broken, but as patterns to be avoided. Every design choice reflected that philosophy. By the time the formation reached its final navigation checkpoints, the hardest part was already complete. The drones were no longer approaching the defended area, they were inside it. Detection windows had been compressed. Reaction timelines had shrunk from minutes to seconds. The engagement had not yet begun, but the outcome was already leaning in one direction. When an attack arrives without warning, without noise, and without urgency, defense is forced to respond from a position of confusion rather than control. And in that imbalance, even the most sophisticated systems can find themselves reacting too late to stop what they never truly saw coming. The moment the formation crossed into the final approach zone, the character of the operation changed. What had been a quiet movement beneath notice now became a test of perception. The defended airspace was no longer empty, but it still appeared so to those watching from above. This illusion was deliberate and temporary. At a carefully chosen distance, a portion of the swarm altered its behavior. A small group broke away and began climbing sharply, abandoning the low-altitude discipline that had protected them until now. Their speed increased. Their profiles shifted. In an instant, they transformed from background noise into unmistakable signals. Radar systems that had remained calm suddenly lit up with contacts that matched long-trained threat models. This was the moment the defenses were waiting for. Automated classification routines identified the rising targets as high-priority threats. Their signatures aligned perfectly with expectations, altitude, velocity, approach vector. To the system, this looked like the opening move of a conventional strike. There was no hesitation. Tracking channels multiplied. Engagement logic flowed exactly as designed. Interceptor missiles launched in rapid sequence, arcing upward to meet targets that seemed both dangerous and imminent. From a technical standpoint, the response was flawless. Expensive interceptors destroyed their targets cleanly far above the battlefield. Confirmation flashes lit the sky. To operators, it appeared as a successful defense. But success came with a hidden cost. Attention narrowed. Resources shifted upward. Sensors focused on altitude rather than proximity. The air defense system, doing precisely what it had been built to do, committed itself to a threat that no longer mattered. The decoys had served their purpose. Below, the main body of the swarm never changed course. It did not climb. It did not accelerate dramatically. It remained low, quiet, and patient, slipping forward while the defensive gaze was fixed elsewhere. Reaction time at close range collapsed. What had been minutes became seconds. This phase demonstrated a critical principle of modern conflict. Deception does not need to defeat a system, it only needs to redirect it. By exploiting the defender's own priorities, the operation forced a misallocation of attention at the exact moment when balance mattered most. When the defenders realized the sky above was empty, the real threat was already too close. The battle had not been won through superior firepower, but through control of perception. In that brief window created by expectation and reinforced by doctrine, the outcome shifted decisively. The system had fired, the interceptors had hit, and yet the defense was already losing the fight it believed it had just won. As attention was pulled upward, responsibility shifted downward, and that transition exposed the most unforgiving phase of the defense. With long-range systems focused elsewhere, close-in protection became the final barrier. These systems were designed for immediacy, short reaction times, rapid fire, and decisive engagement at close range. In theory, they existed precisely for moments like this. In practice, they were about to face a scenario they were never meant to handle alone. The low-flying platforms began to emerge from clutter at an overwhelming pace. Reflections from terrain water and residual electronic noise crowded the sensors. Tracks appeared and disappeared in quick succession. Operators were forced to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. Classification lagged behind reality. The picture on the screen no longer matched the airspace outside. Doctrine took over where clarity ended. Priority shifted toward anything descending or appearing to maneuver aggressively. Weapons opened fire not because targets were fully resolved, but because waiting carried greater risk than acting. The sky filled with tracer arcs, creating a violent lattice meant to deny passage through volume rather than precision. For a brief window, the defense entered saturation not because it was destroyed, but because it was overwhelmed by choice. Each firing solution competed with the next. Heat built in barrels and feeds. Micro-delays crept into confirmation cycles. Individually, these fractions of a second meant little. Together, they created openings. Some attackers were hit. Impacts flashed near the perimeter, but others continued forward, slipping through gaps created by timing rather than failure. The defense was working at maximum output, yet the geometry of the engagement favored the intruders. Low-altitude compressed engagement ranges, speed reduced correction time, volume denied focus. What made this moment decisive was not the number of platforms involved, but the asymmetry of pressure. Defenders were required to identify, prioritize, and destroy every threat. Attackers needed only a few to pass. The burden of perfection rested entirely on one side. As the engagement continued, it became clear that the systems were no longer shaping the fight. They were reacting to it. Each burst chased a moment already gone. Each adjustment arrived a step too late. The defense had not collapsed, but control had. In modern warfare, that distinction matters. Systems do not need to fail catastrophically to be defeated. They only need to be pushed into conditions where reaction replaces decision. In that narrow window created by overload rather than destruction, the balance shifted, and the path to the real targets quietly opened. At the height of the engagement, something unexpected happened. Not an explosion, not a sudden collapse of defenses, but a hesitation. As several of the incoming platforms altered course at the last moment, operators were forced to reassess their assumptions in real time. The primary objective they had been trained to protect no longer appeared to be the immediate focus. For a brief instant, certainty disappeared. That pause mattered. Defensive systems are built around prioritization. They assume that attackers will converge on the most valuable target first, following predictable logic. When movement contradicted that logic, the system's internal rhythm broke. Tracking solutions hesitated. Engagement priorities conflicted. Seconds slipped away as operators tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they expected to see. The attackers exploited that confusion deliberately. Instead of driving straight toward the most obvious objective, the formation shifted, laterally staying low and accelerating only when distance had already collapsed. This maneuver forced defenders to choose continue protecting what they believed mattered most, or reorient toward a developing threat that no longer fit doctrine. By the time the choice became clear, geometry had already turned against the defense. Engagement distances shrank to the point where reaction time was measured in moments, not cycles. Targets dropped even lower, blending into the background of the base itself. What had been airspace became infrastructure. What had been tracking became guessing. This phase revealed a deeper vulnerability in defensive logic. Systems optimized to protect symbols can be misled by attackers who target capability instead. When defense is anchored too tightly to expectation, adaptability becomes its weakest link. The attackers did not need to overpower the defense. They only needed it to hesitate once. That hesitation opened a corridor. The significance of this moment extends beyond the immediate engagement. It demonstrates how modern operations can fracture decision-making rather than hardware. By forcing defenders to question their own assumptions mid-fight, the attackers created an opening that no amount of firepower could instantly close. In complex systems, confidence is as critical as coverage. When confidence falters, even briefly, control erodes. That erosion does not announce itself with alarms or collapse. It manifests quietly in delayed reactions, misaligned priorities, and opportunities seized by those prepared to act faster than doctrine allows. In this case, the outcome was not decided by who had more weapons, but by who understood the defender's logic better. The moment expectations failed, the engagement tipped, and once that balance shifted, recovery was no longer a matter of effort, but of time that no longer existed. What followed was not chaos, but adaptation, and that distinction mattered. As defensive fire intensified, the attacking formation did not behave like a force on the brink of collapse. Losses occurred, but they did not produce hesitation or disorder. Instead, the remaining platforms adjusted. Not broadly, not dramatically, but precisely in increments measured in meters and milliseconds. Each engagement fed information back into the system. The loss of a single unit was not simply attrition, it was data. Trajectories, angles of fire timing, delays, and response patterns were absorbed and redistributed across the formation. What appeared to defenders as erratic movement was in reality a continuous recalibration process unfolding faster than human decision cycles could keep up with. This was the moment where the engagement crossed a threshold. The defense was no longer facing a fixed pattern it could learn and counter. It was facing a moving problem that evolved with every interaction. Flight paths subtly shifted. Altitudes changed in sharp, irregular steps. Approaches no longer repeated. The formation stopped behaving like a group and began behaving like a system. For operators on the ground, the effect was disorienting. Solutions that had worked seconds earlier no longer applied. Locks degraded before engagement could complete. Targets appeared to multiply, then vanish, not because there were more of them, but because prediction itself had become unreliable. The defense was reacting to a picture that no longer reflected the present. This exposed a fundamental asymmetry. Human-operated systems depend on stability, consistent behavior that can be anticipated, classified, and countered. The attackers exploited the opposite. By embracing loss as a learning mechanism, they reduced the cost of experimentation to near zero. Adaptation did not require approval or delay. It happened continuously. What made this phase decisive was not technological superiority, but tempo. The attackers compressed the decision loop until the defense was always one step behind, not because it was slow, but because it was structured around control rather than responsiveness. Each corrective action arrived just late enough to be irrelevant. In modern warfare, this is where advantage often emerges not at the moment of first contact, but at the point where systems diverge in how they learn. One side adjusted in real time, the other relied on procedures designed for a slower fight. Once that divergence became clear, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The engagement was no longer about stopping individual threats. It was about keeping up with a system that treated change itself as a weapon. As the engagement evolved, it became clear that the attackers were no longer simply passing through the defensive zone, they were reshaping it. Each movement forced a reaction. Each reaction altered the environment. The defenders were no longer dictating the terms of engagement. They were being guided by it, pulled into a rhythm that was not their own. What had once been a layered defensive system now behaved like a series of isolated responses. Fire control units chased fleeting targets based on outdated assumptions. Engagement zones overlapped inefficiently. Weapons were expended not where they were most effective, but where attention happened to be focused at that moment. The defense was still active, still firing, still technically operational, but cohesion was slipping. The attackers exploited this fragmentation with discipline. Rather than pressing forward in a straight line, they maneuvered to amplify confusion. Some platforms slowed. Others accelerated briefly before dropping back. Altitude changes were abrupt, forcing recalculations that consumed precious seconds. The goal was not speed, but disruption, forcing defenders to constantly reorient without ever settling into a stable pattern. This phase illustrated a critical shift in modern combat dynamics. Control no longer comes from holding territory or dominating airspace in a traditional sense. It comes from shaping the opponent's decision-making process. When defenses are forced to respond continuously, they lose the ability to plan even seconds ahead. Reaction replaces anticipation. The most damaging effect was not the loss of individual defensive assets or the depletion of ammunition. It was the erosion of synchronization. Systems that were designed to operate as a network began acting independently, each reacting to a different slice of the threat. The whole became less than the sum of its parts. From the outside, the scene still looked like resistance. Tracers filled the sky. Interceptors launched. Commands were issued. But inside the engagement, the balance had shifted. The attackers were no longer navigating through defenses, they were navigating between them, exploiting the spaces created by misaligned reactions. By this point, success was no longer defined by breaching a barrier. The barrier still existed. What had changed was its coherence. Once that coherence fractured, the path forward required less force and more patience. In conflicts shaped by speed of adaptation, the side that forces the other to constantly adjust gains an advantage that compounds rapidly. At this stage, the outcome was not decided by firepower, but by who controlled the flow of decisions. And that control had quietly, decisively changed hands. When the attackers finally converged on the aircraft itself, there was no urgency left in their movement, only precision. The bomber sat motionless, its size and cost once enough to command protection by reputation alone. Now that reputation offered no defense. Infrared signatures revealed what distance and doctrine had failed to hide: heat geometry and vulnerability. The approach was deliberate and low, compressed into a space where reaction time barely existed. Defensive fire continued, but it no longer dictated outcomes. What mattered now was alignment. The attackers were not seeking spectacle. They were not trying to destroy the aircraft in a dramatic explosion. Their objective was far more calculated: render it unusable without announcing victory through fire. The strikes that followed were surgical. Instead of attacking the airframe broadly, they focused on internal systems whose failure would cascade quietly. Entry points were chosen not for visibility but for consequence. Within moments, the aircraft transitioned from a functioning platform to a dormant shell. No flames engulfed the runway. No plume marked the sky. Yet the transformation was absolute. This was the most unsettling outcome for those observing from the ground. The bomber remained physically present. It had not been reduced to debris, but its purpose, its reason for existing, had been removed. Engines that once defined its power were no longer functional. Control systems failed not outwardly but inwardly. The aircraft could neither fly nor be restored quickly. That distinction mattered strategically. A destroyed asset invites replacement planning. A disabled one creates uncertainty. Repair timelines stretch. Specialized components become bottlenecks. Entire units remain tied to recovery efforts rather than redeployment. The aircraft becomes a drain instead of a force multiplier. In that moment, the meaning of loss shifted. The bomber had not been defeated in battle. It had been neutralized as an option. Its presence no longer altered calculations. It no longer represented threat or deterrence. It existed only as a reminder of misplaced confidence. The absence of spectacle was the point. By avoiding a dramatic explosion, the attackers denied observers the comfort of closure. There was no singular moment to frame as defeat or recovery. The aircraft simply stopped functioning, and with it, an assumption stopped holding. Modern warfare increasingly favors this kind of outcome. Not destruction that announces itself, but removal that lingers. When power assets fail quietly, their impact is felt not in images, but in planning rooms and schedules rewritten under pressure. In this case, the aircraft did not burn. It did not fall. It remained exactly where it was, only now it